I stepped out of my editor's office in a joyful mood. He had approved my story idea, the one I'd been pitching for the last 6 months, and now I finally had my dream assignment. Maybe I just wore him down, but I'd like to think that he found real merit in the story. The concept had come to me last summer when my girlfriend and I were visiting the plantation homes along Louisiana's River Road. Along with the beautifully restored antebellum homes, we also noticed several other old mansions in various states of disrepair and dilapidation. I thought it might be interesting to the readers of our Southern Lifestyle magazine to investigate the origin of some of these old homes and give them a thumbnail sketch of their history. After all, everyone knew or could find out about the history of places like Oak Alley Plantation or Nottoway, but perhaps some of these other old places had histories that were just as interesting. As it turned out, for most of the homes, all I could find was property records at the courthouse. They contained the names of the past owners who sometimes led colorful lives, but there was precious little information about the properties themselves. I put together what I could, but was worried that what I had been able to dig up wouldn't be enough to satisfy my editor. It would be bad enough that I had so little to show for my efforts, but what was potentially worse was that it might convince him that all of my ideas really weren't that great after all, and I'd be relegated back to covering holiday decorating tips from Miss Betty Lou Bush in Oxford, Mississippi. No offense to Mrs. Bush of Oxford, Mississippi. The fifth and final house looked more promising. La Maison des Chaines, as it was known, was a Greek revival mansion similar in appearance to Nottoway Plantation, but on a bit smaller scale. The property itself was overgrown with brush, and the building had fallen into a bad state, a fire clearly having ravaged the first floor, but looking at it under the majestic moss-draped oaks, you could still see glimpses of its former glory. In researching, I found that there were news stories in the local paper about the home, and particularly about the fire that had occurred there. What made it more interesting was not what the stories said, but what they did not say. The stories indicated there was indeed a fire that occurred in 1901 that started in the kitchen, doing significant damage to the house. There was, however, no mention as to whether anyone was killed or injured. A former Army major named Lejeune owned the house at that time, and the subtext of the article was that Major Lejeune was a very prominent member of society who had the power to squash any official investigation into the cause of the fire or whether it caused any deaths or injuries. The problem was that unless I could find something more substantial, it wouldn't be enough to generate any real interest. I was about to admit defeat when I remembered an important detail. Just up the road and across the highway from the old maison stood an old bungalow that looked like it had been there for many years. The last time I had passed it, there was an elderly woman tending garden. She looked to be about 80 or 90 years old, and while she would not have been alive at the time of the fire, she may have known someone who was, or might have had some knowledge or background that could save my story. I climbed into my car and drove back to the little house, hoping the old woman was there. When I arrived, I noticed that while the house was quite old, it was exceptionally well kept. It had recently received a fresh coat of white paint, and the garden was neat with colorful flowers blooming all around. I walked up the brick stairs to the porch and knocked on the door. It took several moments, but eventually I heard the lock turning, and a little old woman appeared behind the screen door. "Hi, my name is Kate Hebert," I said, introducing myself. "I'm with Gulf Coast Living magazine, and I'm doing a story on some of the old abandoned mansions along River Road. One of the houses on my list is La Maison des Chaines, just up the road there, and I was wondering if you would have any information that could help me." The old woman smiled. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Hebert. I'm Annabelle Arsenault. Being honest, I don't have many visitors. This day and age, you never do know what kind of people you're going to meet, but you look like a gentleman to me." She chuckled slightly. "If you don't mind being a little warm, I'd be happy to sit for a while on the porch and visit. I'll fix us some lemonade, and you can tell me what you're interested in knowing." "I'd like that." As the old woman disappeared, I wondered how long she had lived here. It suddenly hit me that there must be a Mr. Arsenault somewhere. I hadn't seen anyone other than the old lady, but that didn't mean he didn't exist. Ms. Arsenault returned shortly, pushing an ancient tea cart carrying a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses filled with ice. "So, Mrs. Arsenault," I began, "how long have you lived here?" "It's Miss, I'm afraid," she answered. "What?" "Miss Arsenault, but please call me Annabelle." She paused briefly and grimaced slightly, as if remembering something painful. "I never married. No, my Wilford and I, we were planning to get married, but he was killed in the army in 1950. He was in Korea, the Chosin Reservoir. I was never able to find anyone measuring up to him, and I wasn't ready to settle for just any man. I'm so sorry, I said, sympathizing with the old woman. Into every life a little rain must fall, she sighed. But the Lord's been mighty good to me over the years, so I'm not complaining. I've never spent a day in the hospital, not one. Never even seen a doctor going on 84 years now. That is amazing, I responded. Hardy woman, no doubt from good stock. Much different from me. Seemed like every time seasons changed, I was coming down with some sort of ailment or the other. I was doing some research on the house, I continued, getting to the point, and I found out there was a fire there in 1901. Do you happen to know anything about that fire that happened around that time? Now, I wasn't around at the time, of course, but I remember what my mama told me about that many years later. She worked for Major Andre Lejeune, the man who used to own your house years back when she was just a teenager. I nodded. Well, you probably don't know about the Major. He was real famous around here. Fought with Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill, or so he claimed. He also claimed that he was relation to Marshal St. Pierre, the man that built the house back in the early 1800s, though I don't know the connection. His grandson, Alexander, the last St. Pierre to live in the house, died without an heir. So maybe there was a sister somewhere or a cousin, I don't really know. Hit upon some hard times after the Civil War, but it seemed like it was coming back some by the time Major Lejeune moved in. Mama said he was shot in the left arm and that he was always complaining about it when it got cold around here. She also used to say he must have been hit in his head, too, because when he came back from the wars, he was all mean and crazy. Now, Miss Lejeune, she was different. She treated everybody kindly, didn't have nothing bad to say about no one. White, black, sharecropper, maid, they was all the same to her. That's why the children was always there. Mrs. Lejeune said they couldn't have children of their own, so she let the children come to the house to eat lunch in the kitchen downstairs while their parents worked out in the fields or in the house. I tried to picture the scene in my mind. The old woman continued, I don't know that I should be telling you this, but according to Mama, they say Mr. Lejeune was having an affair with one of the women who worked in the kitchen, a black woman. Of course, they had both black and white women who worked in the kitchen. Mrs. Lejeune wasn't no one to make no distinctions on that. The Major wasn't so tolerant, though. Come to find out, the woman he was running around with ended up pregnant, and word was she had told more than one person that Mr. Lejeune was the father. When it got back to him, he decided he had to do something for sure to make sure no one found out. From here, it's just guessing. She looked up at me with a faraway gaze. I can't say one way or the other, 'cause I wasn't there, neither was Mama. She was sick that day, and it's a good thing she was, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here right now. But from what the police said, later, it looked like the door from the kitchen had been locked from the outside, and there was no way for the children who were eating in there or the kitchen helpers to get out when the fire started. Ain't none of them made it out. How did the fire start? I asked. No one really knows, Miss Annabelle said, shrugging her shoulders dismissively. Could have been an accident, I guess, but then it's awfully suspicious that door was locked. Mama said no one had ever locked it before. So if several people died in the fire, how was it that it was never reported? Wasn't there an investigation? The old woman muttered dismissively. It's like I said, Major Lejeune was a powerful man around here. A few kitchen helpers and some sharecroppers' kids, that ain't nothing. Surely someone talked, maybe not then, but later. From what I hear, a few dollars placed in the right hands and nobody knew nothing. Don't take much to improve the life of a sharecropper. So he bought this silence. I stood up, running my hand through my hair. This is amazing, I said, shaking my head. You want my advice, Miss Annabelle offered, you leave well enough alone. There's lots of ghosts in that place. Been going on for a long time before that fire. You don't want to be stirring that up. Evil feeds upon evil, changes people. But it's all in the past now, and everyone involved is dead now, so there can't be no justice for those who are gone. If you do, it'll just eat you up like it did to Major Lejeune, just like it did to my mama. Sometimes it's better just to let old ghosts lie. I wish I could, Miss Annabelle. I wish I could, I replied, thinking about my story. You and me both, the older woman replied. I paused briefly, then straightened up, offering my hand. It's been a great pleasure meeting you. I do have to get going, but I hope we can talk again sometime. Miss Annabella rose too. You think about what I said now. You're a smart young man and full of life. I hate to see you dragged down by something that's long gone and in the past. I simply smiled in return as I headed down the steps toward the sidewalk. I noticed I was down to a quarter tank as I pulled out, so I started back in the direction from which I had come. There was a little convenience store about half a mile up the road where I could fill my tank. On the way back from filling up, a flash of lightning struck only a few yards from my ancient Volvo, immediately followed by a roar of thunder that rattled the windows and startled and frightened me to the point that I almost ran off the road. In the brief time it had taken me for gas up and get back on the highway towards where the Maison stood, the weather had changed dramatically. Such wild swings were not an uncommon summer phenomenon around these parts, as brief but severe thunderstorms swept inland from the Gulf of Mexico. But to me, it seemed as if like supernatural forces were conspiring against me. Steeling myself, I drove onward, rounding the slight bend in the road that signaled the entrance to the old house. I looked around, expecting to see the Arsenault house looming up out of the rain any second. Had I not been paying attention, I would have missed it. As it was, I had half driven past it before I realized what I had done. I slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, heedless to whether anyone was behind me or not. If anyone had been behind me, I would have been rear-ended for sure. I stared dumbfounded at the sight before me. The little house where I had just visited Annabelle Arsenault was gone, or nearly so. It had clearly been ravaged by fire, and not recently. In fact, the lot was overgrown with weeds and brush. The roof was collapsed, and stray branches poked through gaping blackened window frames. There was no trace of the garden that the old woman had so carefully tended, and the porch where it had lemonade with turbans barely recognizable. Stunned, I pulled over to the side of the road so I would be out of harm's way and stared at what was left of the little bungalow. It was simply not possible that this was the same house I had visited just a few minutes ago. The rain had let up some, but it was still coming down, so I reached into the back seat and grabbed an umbrella. Checking for traffic, I stepped out of my car and hurried across the road to where the remains of the little house stood. I tried to picture what I could remember of the house, but I just could not reconcile what I was looking at now with the way that it had been a short time ago. What had happened here? It just did not seem possible. Worse still, I could not accept that this damage had been done recently. It had to have taken years, possibly decades, for nature to have reclaimed this property so completely. I picked my way carefully up the walkway, mindful of the thorny vines that threatened to reach out and take hold of my jeans. The temperature dropped several degrees, causing me to shiver in my short sleeves. As I mounted the stairs to climb the porch, a stiff breeze from off the river whipped by. The floor of the porch creaked under my weight, but seemed to be in fair shape relative to the rest of the place. Closing my umbrella, I tentatively made my way from window to window, peering in, as if that would give me some insight as to what had happened. I wondered what had happened to Miss Annabelle. It was apparent that no one had lived here any more. I hadn't recalled the old woman mentioning any relatives, and I hoped that she hadn't ended up in a nursing home or something like that. Whatever infirmities she may have had, Miss Annabelle seemed like a spry old woman. Those kinds of places were soul killers, with their lack of freedom and endless hours spent under the watchful eyes of an ever-present but none too friendly staff of underpaid and overworked orderlies and nurses. Suddenly I had an eerie feeling as if I was being watched. The chill I had felt earlier seemed to engulf my whole body, and I began to feel ill. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I reached out and grabbed the nearest post, hoping that it wouldn't collapse under my weight, taking what remained of the roof and porch with it. I dropped to my knees and felt as if I was going to faint. Half crawling, I left my umbrella there and stumbled to the edge of the porch, willing myself to keep moving. If I could just get back to my car, I felt I could make it to the little store where I had filled up earlier. There I could at least get a bottle of water, and if need be, they could call an ambulance if I felt myself getting worse. I was breathing hard by the time I reached my vehicle, but the worst of it appeared to have passed. I wasn't sure what had hit me, but I could almost swear that I had felt a presence on that porch, and somehow sensed that it was the presence of Annabelle Arsenault. I had almost returned normal when I turned into the oyster shell parking lot of Lulu's Gas and Grocery. A lighted marquee sign advertised live bait and boudin. Hopefully they were not one and the same. Walking through the light rain, I was too immersed in my own thoughts to even care. There was a jingle of a bell as I opened the door of the grocery, and a tall, middle-aged man looked up briefly from the clipboard he was writing on, long enough to acknowledge my presence. "Afternoon," he nodded. I returned his greeting and headed back to the cooler, searching for the biggest bottle of water I could find. Truth was, I would have preferred one of the 24-ounce Bud Lights that were being advertised as 2 for $2.99, or perhaps something stronger, but I was driving and needed a clear head. I settled for a large bottle of Fiji water and headed for the checkout. The guy up front, whose name tag identified him as Bubba, had finished whatever he was working on when I had come in and was waiting to check me out. "Quite a storm," he said casually. "Came up awful quick." "Yeah, it did," I smiled before continuing. "Hey, I was wondering, I was just up the road and noticed that little house that was across the street from the old mansion that's overgrown had burned down. When did that happen? What happened to the lady that lived there?" "What, old Lady Arsenault's house? Man, that house hadn't been lived in for at least 20 years. "Well, that's impossible. I visited Annabelle Arsenault just a little while ago." "Well, you would have had to visit her in the graveyard, because that's where she's been since her house burned down." "I don't understand." "It's true. I was here when it happened. I was getting ready to close up for the night when some guy drove up here and said to call the fire department because the house up the road was on fire. I called up to Bob Duplantis' house because that's all we had at the time was a volunteer department, and Bob was the acting captain. He got his boys together and they came down in the truck, but by then it was too late. Wasn't nothing left of the house by then. Found Mrs. Arsenault." "It's Miss," I interrupted. "Beg pardon?" "It's Miss Arsenault," I corrected. "She was never married." "Oh, okay, Miss Arsenault. Anyway, they found her body inside the front door. Poor lady. Looked like maybe she'd been trying to get out, they said. I didn't really know her that well myself. I just started working here, and she really didn't come here that often. She was littered at her grocery shopping somewhere else, I guess. She did keep her little place up real nice, though. She liked the garden." "Are you sure about all this?" I insisted. "Of course, like I said, I was here when it happened," Bubba replied. "And no one has lived there for over 20 years. "Nope. The place was condemned by the parish. They would have torn it down, I guess, but money's tight, you know. I guess there wasn't enough left in her estate after she was gone to have it done, so it's just been sitting like that." He shrugged his shoulders. I glanced outside. The rain had slowed to a slight drizzle, and the sky appeared to be clearing from the south. "Thanks," I said, and paid for the water and left. I didn't know what else to say. Of course, the man was right. There was no way that house had burned so recently, and he had no reason to lie. But that only made things more confusing and more creepy. Maybe my story would be more interesting than I ever imagined. But would anyone believe me?